I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today. I love visiting the Netherlands, and I know this is the most interesting meeting. I can't even be with you on Skype because at the time of my presentation, I will be giving another presentation in Japan. I've been in Japan for the last 10 days or so. But I hope that you'll enjoy what I have to say in the next half an hour, knowing that at the end of it, my closest colleague, Professor Clinton Jenkins, will be available on Skype to answer the questions, most of them, I'm sure, about the work we have done together. Again, I apologize for not being there. I wish you all well.
I want to address a number of key questions. I want to talk about how many species there are, how many are missing, how do we know they're going extinct, and most importantly of all, I want to talk about ways in which we can prevent future extinctions. That's the ultimate challenge. So the question is, what do we know about species extinctions? Well, according to Al Gore, they're going extinct 1,000 times faster than they should be. I'd like to think that Al Gore got his insight from this street demonstration in Britain, but in fact the answer is somewhat more prosaic. My group and I, a few years ago, decided we ought to be looking at new ways of estimating the rates of extinction. And we realized that just simply talking about the numbers of extinctions happening per day or per year was not a good way of doing things. Not least of which is that when you do that, people are likely to ask you to name the species that are going extinct. What was the species that went extinct per day? So why did Al Gore say it in that way? And what's wrong with looking at the numbers of species going extinct per day? The problem is that we simply do not have a good estimate of how many species there are. We know some species quite well, vertebrates in particular, and the catalogues for them are probably quite complete. But when it comes to arthropods, insects in particular, fungi, and many other groups like that, we just simply don't know. The estimates are all over the place. Some people would like to think there are 8 million species. Other good people think 20. The salient features is the numbers differ very, very greatly indeed. So, I want to address 4 questions. How many species there are? And how many do we not know yet, and can we estimate that number? How many species are going extinct? How are we doing at protecting them? And can we do better? I think these are significant challenges. We have names for about 2 million species. The question is, can we estimate the number of species that are missing? And at least in theory, it ought to be possible to do that. It ought not to be a difficult task. Consider this hitherto unknown group of species, the large and as yet undescribed group of unicorn species. The basic idea is, having discovered the unknown continent where these species occur, can we estimate the total number of species living in the wild from the rates at which we describe them? Well, after their first discovery, we might describe a lot of species in the first decade. There are a lot of species that are still new. But as time progresses, we find that there are fewer unknown species. More of the species are known from museums, and fewer unknown species leave behind in the wild. So probably the second decade, we're not going to describe as many. And you get the idea that as time progresses, there will be fewer and fewer species described by taxonomists. The rate of species description will slow to the point where, of course, eventually there will be almost no species as yet unknown. So the rates will drop decade after decade as we describe new species. It's such a good idea. It seems such a compelling idea that should be allow us to estimate with a sort of simple statistical model how many species remain to be discovered. The problem with this idea, the idea that the rates of species descriptions go down over time, is that it doesn't actually work like that. If you look at the number of species of flowers that have been described, for example, the numbers have increased dramatically, particularly over the last 30 or 40 years. The explanation, of course, is the number of taxonomists has also increased. By taxonomists, I mean the people who describe species, which is most definitely a different kind of taxonomist than those of 100 years ago. Many, many more people are involved in taxonomic activity. Be that as it may, there's more effort that has been expended into the process of describing plants. And the consequence of that is, with more effort, there's more species. But we can correct that by looking at the number of species of plants described per taxonomist. And after an initial period when it fluctuated, we can see that for more than a century, the rate of taxonomic description per taxonomist has declined. And interestingly, that allows us to do two things. It can predict when taxonomy will come to an end, rather likely, my prediction is 2030. But it also suggests that about 15% more plant species are likely to be as yet unknown. In short, it doesn't make a lot of sense to try and talk about the number of species going extinct today when we only have very, very uncertain estimates about how many species there are. So if we don't know how many species there are, it doesn't make a lot of sense to calculate how many are going extinct. But we can talk about death rates. And there's an analogy here to human death rates. We have a good idea of how many people die, about 8 people per 1,000 per year globally. That's a typical death rate. Of course, there are circumstances like during wars when the death rates are very, very much higher. Well, extinction is a death rate. It's a death rate of species rather than as individuals. And we can calculate those death rates. We can go to well-known taxa, birds, mammals, and extinctions, and we calculate how many extinctions there are, in this case, per million species per year. And the numbers work out to be somewhere between 500 to as low as 50 extinctions per million species per year. The question then is, what do we expect? What's the background rate? What's the sort of the number that we ought to be expecting? We can use the fossil data. We can use the diversification rates of species. And we can begin to dissect birth and diversification rates out using detailed molecular phylogenies. But to cut that very complicated subject down to a simple result, The answer is for many, many groups of animals and plants where there are good molecular phylogenies, the diversification rates are on the order of zero 0.1 or 0.5 new species per million species per year. That diversification rate is very, very much smaller than the roughly 100 to 1,000 extinctions per million species years that one finds across well-known taxa. In other words, we are driving species to extinction very, very much faster than they are diversifying. So my next question is, how well are we doing at protecting species? Over the last 30 or so years, the world has created a large number of protected areas, both on land and in the ocean. This is a map that shows two things. It shows in green where the protected areas are, and in buff the areas that are wild, in the sense of having a very, very low human impact. In fact, it shows the half of Earth that has the least impact. Most protected areas are in wild places. They're in the Sahara, they're in the Amazon, they're in northern Greenland, they're in deserts, they're in cold places, remote places. And one of the challenges that the world faces as nations meet in Kunming in China to discuss the next decade of progress on protecting biodiversity is, what more should we protect? I've flown over this national park. It's 1,000,000 square kilometers of northern Greenland. I have no intention of being there in person. It's a little bit too cold, and I suspect it has very, very few species indeed. It's an indication of the kinds of places that are easy to protect, not that are good for biodiversity. So let's think about how well these wild places do at protecting species. By chance alone, we would expect 13% of a species range to be protected and 50% of a species range to be in a wild place. And we can look at species to see how well on average they've done. So here's a hypothetical species that has a large geographical range, and you see from this suggestion that it's partly protected, partly not protected, and half of its range is in wilderness. Now this, as I have drawn it, is a species with a large geographical range. The question is, what happens when we have a bunch of species with tiny geographical ranges? Going back to unicorns, which I assume have very tiny geographical ranges, perhaps one unicorn species would be entirely within a protected area. A couple of them, maybe half of them, are in wilderness, and then some of them in areas that are not protected. This simple model means that we can imagine looking at how well we have protected nature in terms of their geographical ranges. What we see for species that have large geographical ranges, say more than 10 million square kilometers, is, as expected, about 13% of those ranges are in protected areas, and about, very close to, 50% of the ranges are in wilderness. In other words, for large range species, we have done just what we would expect by chance. But, a surprising but, a hugely important but. If we look at species that have small geographical ranges, we find that we have done very, very much better than the 13%. A lot of small range species have already 30–40% of their ranges protected. That's very, very good. We should pat ourselves on the back. Importantly, species protection in wilderness would not improve that. So we've done a much better job than many people think. These species all have tiny geographical ranges, and we've really done an incredible job of protecting them. That's the skywalker gibbon up at the top left, and a newly described species of poison dart frog, which occurs on one of the projects that we manage with Saving Nature. Now, can we do better? Ed Wilson wants us to protect half of Earth. Other people say, we ought to be protecting bigger and better areas. The problem is that just protecting more wilderness will not get us to protecting more species. It's an easy thing to tell politicians that we want more, but it has to be the right more. And in discussions with Ed, we've agreed that, half Earth is it's a marvelous inspiration. But let's be very careful for what we ask. If next year the world comes together and says we want to protect 25% of Earth, we don't want it to be more of northern Greenland. We don't want it to be more of the Sahara. We want it to be places that matter. My final question is to ask, can we do better? Can we be smart in how we protect nature? We can map out the distribution of many species now in considerable detail. These are birds, and they show that the warm, wet tropics are where most of the species are. Mammals show a broadly similar pattern. These are the places with the greatest concentration of species, and it's likely to be true for most species. Amphibians, for example, show a similar pattern, and while we have less detailed data for plants, it's almost certainly true for them too. But just looking at species is not sufficient. We need to dig deeper. Let's look again at the distribution of bird species. In the Amazon, there are the greatest numbers of species. But if we look at where species have smaller than the median range size, those distributions are profoundly different. They concentrate in Central America and in the northern Andes, and in places like the coastal forests of Brazil. That's important because species with small ranges are much more vulnerable to extinction than species with large ranges. So let's take a world tour where threatened species are. Our first stop is the northern Andes, and Saving Nature is involved in several projects in Colombia and Ecuador, where the habitat destruction combined with the high numbers of small range species means that there are a lot of species at risk of extinction. Our second area of concern is in coastal Brazil. Again, loss of habitat, concentrations of small range species means that there are worrying numbers of threatened birds and mammals and amphibians and likely many other species in these forests. The final area where Saving Nature works is in tropical Asia. We have three areas of interest: the Western Ghats of India, Assam up in the northeast on the borders with China, and the Lusa ecosystem of northern Sumatra. These maps are what we call strategic maps. They tell us where in the world we need to act, but they don't tell us exactly how to act. For that we need tactical maps like this one, and I'll explain those on the project pages for each of the various places where Saving Nature works. So let's look at coastal Brazil as a case history. It has exceptional numbers of threatened birds and similar numbers of mammals and amphibians at risk and surely plants too. It's not hard to understand why. If we look at the satellite imagery of this area, we see that remarkably little forest remains. It's an area where human actions have destroyed about 95% of the forest cover. The important thing is that it's worse than that. That if you look at this area in some detail, you begin to realize that what forest remains is in fragments. This close-up shows an area just to the east of Rio de Janeiro. There's forest, but as you can see, a lot of that forest it's in fragments. It's in small pieces, and sort of using the magic of GIS, we can take out those small pieces. And when you look at what happens when you take out those small pieces, you recognize that a lot of the forest is in little pieces, tiny isolated patches of forest. Now, we have a very, very good understanding of what happens to species in forest fragments. There are lots of surveys done all over the world that shows in landscapes like this, where the forest that remains is in pieces, that those pieces have fewer species in them than large continuous blocks of forest. Almost certainly, the most compelling study is the largest, most ambitious ecological experiment ever done. Tom created an experiment in the Amazon, where an area was going to be cleared for cattle ranching, but forest had to be retained by law. Tom designed forest fragments of 1, 10, 100, and 1 10,000 hectares that allowed us to follow the fate of species in those fragments over time. That work has been going on for 40 years now, and we have a very, very detailed longitudinal study that shows things of this kind. These are the numbers of species in fragments of 1, 10, and 100 hectares. And they show that small fragments lose species much more quickly than large fragments do. And in fact, we can calculate a sort of a half-life. How long does it take to lose half of the species that you're eventually going to lose? And combined with studies that my colleagues and I have done in Kenya, also on tropical forests, with a slightly less rigorous experimental design, we get a remarkably useful result. It's a result that shows you that you need to have fragments of at least 1,000, preferably 10,000 hectares, if you are going to slow the rates of species losses down. Identify the places where the greatest number of species are at risk of extinction. And when we do that, we often find they're in very fragmented landscapes. They're not in large areas of continuous forest like the Amazon, but they're in the biodiversity hotspots, and those places have already lost a lot of their habitats. A good example of this is in the forest to the east of the city of Rio de Janeiro in coastal Brazil. This map shows the fragments and the number of threatened species that they contain. We have not just merely destroyed so much of the world's tropical forests. What we have left behind is in tatters, in fragments. And those fragments are often too small for species to maintain viable populations. There just aren't enough
males to go around for the females and females to go around for the males. And of all the places, of all the fragments, one that I thought was particularly tragic was the one immediately behind me. This is the Union Biological Reserve in coastal Brazil, about 100 miles east of the city of Rio de Janeiro. Because in this isolated patch of forest are a whole load of species on the brink of extinction, the most charismatic of which is a beautiful little monkey called the golden lion tamarin. And the golden lion tamarins in that fragment could not go forth and multiply into the forest over there because there was the cattle pasture behind me. And when I saw that cattle pasture for the first time about 8 years ago, a cattle pasture just like the one I'm standing in, I thought, it has to go. And so we have made it go away. This is a restored forest. I helped raise money for my friends at the Asociação Mico Leão Dourado, the Golden Lion Tamarin Association. I've planted this forest, and it now connects that once isolated fragment of forest in the Union Biological Reserve to a much larger area of forest over in this direction. It's what we call a biological corridor, and it means that the golden lion tamarins that were once imprisoned in this forest island, this forest fragment behind me, can now cross through these small but growing trees and go and find new habitats, new homes, new places for their tamarin families.
This project was a joint effort between Saving Nature and the Small Grants Programme for Nature of IUC in the Netherlands. This is what the cattle pasture looked like about 10 years ago. Very degraded, very poor place for cattle, but such an important place for biodiversity. And a few years ago, it looked like this. I can't take a photograph from here now because it's now thick forest and you can't see. This biological corridor connects an isolated reserve. It's now no longer isolated. The species can move between the nature reserve and the, in fact, expanded nature reserve, which is at higher elevations, allowing the species to move upslope given global warming. What we do at Saving Nature, in collaboration with our partners, is to use good science and commitment to local communities to reduce species extinctions. In short, we know species extinctions are too high, we know where they're concentrated, we need to protect more areas, we need to be smart in how we do the protection, and we need to connect the landscapes that we have left in fragments. Thank you so much. My colleague Clinton Jenkins will answer questions.